All right. Well, again, welcome everybody. Today's presentation is entitled Vermont Moose, an overview of moose ecology and the recent research findings. And we'll be talking about the impacts of a changing climate on Vermont's moose population. Today's webinar really came about because like last spring, actually late last winter, I had the opportunity to drive up to Montgomery for a presentation and a program on legacy planning. And while I was driving up to Montgomery, we passed this area that I thought for sure was perfect moose habitat. And so, as I'm driving through, I'm looking into the wetland area and expecting to see, one, maybe even two moose off in the distance. And needless to say, there were no moose present that morning. And so while I was at the program and just sharing my disappointment with some of the program participants, I learned that my concern about Vermont's moose population, I was not alone in my concern. And so, I think for many of us, thinking about our changing forests and the impacts on our wildlife populations here, thinking about the implications of a changing climate on the moose population, it really has become front and center in many of our minds. And so I'm really pleased today. We're joined by Josh Blouin, who is a wildlife biologist with Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. He specializes on moose, and Josh is going to give us an update on the moose population and discuss some of the strategies that land managers and landowners can be thinking about to help keep this iconic species on our landscape here in Vermont in the face of a changing climate. And so with that introduction, Josh, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you for today's presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. And I'm really happy to be here with you all. As Kate mentioned, my name is Josh Blouin. I work for Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. As a wildlife biologist, I cover kind of a variety of different things, but moose has certainly been a part of my past here in Vermont, and something I'm very passionate about and continue to be involved in. And so I'm excited to be here today. And as Kate mentioned, we'll kind of cover a bunch of things, including an overview of kind of moose ecology, kind of present some of the issues that moose are facing, and then just some topics that you can think about as a landowner or somebody concerned about moose and moose management here in Vermont and beyond. So with that, I think it's really important to have an understanding of moose range in North America, right? Where do moose exist? And I think that's really important when discussing some of these stresses that moose are currently facing and will likely continue to face with a changing climate. So for context, where do moose exist in North America? As you can see outlined in blue here, moose tend to be a more boreal species, a more northern species, more northern climate adapted. And so, as you can see in the far right corner there, where we are in Vermont is really at that southern periphery of where moose tend to be in North America. And I think this is just really important to kick off this presentation and to keep that in mind as we're moving forward today and discussing some of the challenges for moose, because we are at that southern range, and that's really important when we're talking about some of these challenges that they are facing and will likely continue to face. And so if we kind of zoomed into that star here in Vermont on that map, kind of what is the history of moose here in Vermont and the habitats that they maybe depend on. And so it's important to have kind of that context of our land use history, right? So in early Vermont, when our landscape was roughly 95% forested, moose were fairly prevalent on the landscape, and as a large, relatively easy animal to hunt, moose were an important source of food and clothing for not only indigenous peoples of the region, but also early European settlers. Vermont experienced a massive population boom. This is all, if you spent any time in Vermont, these are things you probably know. But during the second half of the 18th century, Vermont went from less than 3,000 settlers of European descent in roughly 1760 to about 155,000 by 1800. So in a 40-year period, we had an increase of roughly 150,000+ people into the state. And with that massive population boom came changes to the landscape and the land use practices. So many of these new settlers were sheep farmers, right? A lot of people coming into Vermont were looking to cash in on that boom in the global wool market. And so with that came changes to our landscape and the landscape that moose and other animals depended on. Much of the state was degraded in a lot of ways or developed for agricultural reasons. At the same time, you had unregulated hunting pressures. And so that habitat degradation with that hunting pressure led to the extirpation of moose from the state by the late 1800s. And just for reference, this land conversion of forest fields really began around 1800 and peaked by about 1880, after which only about 37% of Vermont remained forested. So you went from roughly 95% down to about 35%. So a dramatic change in a relatively short period of time. So moose really were extirpated or no longer on the landscape here in Vermont. By the 19th century, by the 20th century, sorry, those hill farms really began to kind of go out of business on a vast scale. And those hard-won fields were gradually being covered over by new growth, right? The forest was evolving, the land was evolving and changing with the change in land use practices. And we started to see some animals returning here to Vermont, moose included. So by the 1960s, there were roughly, I think, 25 moose were thought to exist up in Essex County, up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And by 1980, our forests were now covering roughly 80% of the land area of Vermont again. So again, another dramatic change, right? And what our landscape looks like. And with that, our moose numbers were slowly increasing to a point now by the 80s, they were starting to be seen on a more regular basis up in Northeast Kingdom and Essex County. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and moose, believe it or not, were exceeding both social and biological carrying capacities. And when I say that, like social carrying capacity, for example, areas of the Northeast Kingdom, moose were exceeding in some areas more than 5 moose per square mile. And so this was, really a lot of moose on the landscape. This is an ecosystem with few natural predators for moose. And so the population boomed. And with that, many of the residents of the Northeast Kingdom, over a third of the residents in a 2007 survey, actually wanted moose to be decreased on the landscape. They wanted fewer moose on the landscape. So as that population kind of boomed and exceeded social carrying capacity, moose were kind of being seen as a pest in some ways, right? Which is not what we want as managers or researchers or people who care about our moose population. At the same time, we had other stakeholders, landowners, whether it be large paper companies or small private loggers, sugar operators, people who were having a lot of issues with moose, high numbers of densities that were impacting how the forest grows and investments that people rely on. So that upper left-hand corner photo is just an example of, some areas with really high moose density. If you enclose those areas with a fence, that can have impacts. That browse can have really important impacts on forest regeneration, right? When you're at really high densities. So things were changing really quickly. And Vermont, as you can see in that last slide there, I forgot to mention our population was roughly, 5,000 individuals. And the goal was to actually deal with those issues of exceeding social and biological carrying capacities by creating a permitted hunt for moose in the state. So in the early 90s, Vermont actively started hunting moose. And the goal was to reduce that population in the early 2000s, especially when that population really boomed. Started out really slow, and then by the early 2000s, we really bumped up permits to deal with some of these issues of declining individual health due to overpopulation, overbrowsing, things of that nature. And the goal was to reduce that population down to roughly 3,000 individuals. And this was successful, right? This was a tool that we had that was really effective in reducing that moose population. But managers continued to see declines in individuals' health and noting particular things on the climate that were noting that there was something else kind of going on, right, on the landscape. And so what was happening? We knew from neighboring states in New Hampshire and Maine that some of these issues might be related to a parasite load, winter ticks in particular, which I'll talk more about here soon. So this was a really successful tool, but when we started to decline those permits, something else was happening. And so this really initiated Vermont's first ever moose research project. This was a dedicated project where I first started with the department back in 2017. And our goal was to fix moose with radio collars. So we put 126 radio collars out up in Essex County, up in the northeast corner of Vermont. Wildlife management units E1 and E2, which you can see on that map on the right. Way up in that corner. And really the purpose was to examine mortality rates and productivity rates. So, what was driving some of those high mortalities and having an impact on an adult female's ability to give birth and have healthy offspring. And so, this was a really interesting project. In the wintertime, we put those collars out and we would head out into the field and track those individuals. And so in the wintertime, we were heading out using that telemetry, using our equipment to get up close to these moose and collect fecal samples and urine samples. And really, in the wintertime, the goal was to collect those samples and look at urea nitrogen levels and determine stress and stress indicators. So when did our moose start to show signs of deterioration? And can we relate that to this winter tick life cycle? And I'd be lying if I said all this was done gracefully. As you can see on the bottom left there, I'm in my snowshoes and snow up over my hip in victory. And so, these were hard days, really difficult, challenging conditions. But as a researcher and as a seasonal with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, this is a great opportunity to get to know our study animal, right? Get up close and personal and learn a lot about moose. So that was what we were up to in the winter. And in the springtime, as we progressed into the April time period, in particular, we started to see mortality. This is what we called our mortality season. And it's definitely the most grim part of our work, right, of our study. And this is kind of what people think about when we think about some of the issues moose have been facing here. So myself and a colleague would get a text message or an email whenever one of our collared moose stopped moving for 6 hours. And we would run out and perform a full necropsy. And so we would head out and, actually look at that individual, take a piece of every organ and send that to a lab and try to determine what was causing that mortality in the individual. And what we found was similar to our neighboring states, in that heavy infestation of winter ticks was really a driving force of mortality for our moose population, particularly individuals less than a year old. And just for context, when we would perform these necropsies, when I say heavy infestation of winter ticks, we would actually take the hide off of an individual calf, freeze it, and in the summertime have the fun project of cutting the hide in half and actually cutting like 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter patches, trimming the hair, what hair was left in some areas, and actually counting ticks, 8-10 hour days of counting ticks. And the idea was, we wanted a number. We wanted something that people could relate to and understand what was happening here. And so when I say heavy infestations, we counted, I think the highest on a calf, these are all calves, the highest we counted was over 35,000 ticks on half of a calf hide. So you're talking, 70,000 ticks conservatively on a calf. So this is a really gruesome, horrific way for an individual to die. And again, this isn't happening because the moose has Lyme's disease. They're not having some sort of response to a disease from these winter ticks. Moose are dying because they're anemic. It's blood loss from the sheer number of ticks on a moose. And this can have profound impacts on our moose population, right? If 50% of our calves, which is we're hovering around that number during the 3 years of our study, 50% of your calves are not being recruited to be an adult. That has a serious impact on your population, right? So it's an important thing to note for us here in Vermont and neighboring states. But really, to get a full picture of this issue, it's complex. It's a really complex ecosystem level issue. And so to have a better understanding, it's important to think about this winter tick life cycle. The winter tick is different than a lot of other ticks we have here in Vermont, in that they're one host species. So I think we have 14, maybe 15 species of ticks here in Vermont. But the winter tick is unique in that they go through all their life cycles on one animal. And in the tick's mind frame, if it can be a moose, that's most ideal. So we'll jump into this cycle here when those winter ticks are larvae and they're climbing up vegetation and they're seeking that host, preferably a moose. They climb up that individual, they get on that individual, and I say preferably a moose because moose tend to not groom themselves heavily for winter ticks. Other animals like deer and bears walking through the woods, they may pick up these winter ticks, but they tend to groom themselves because they've kind of evolved with that ectoparasite. Where moose, they've again evolved in those more northern climates. They may get some ticks on them, but it doesn't tend to kill them. So these winter ticks are preferably getting on moose in the fall. They then go through 2 life cycles on the moose, nymph and adult. And then in that late spring, early winter time period, these winter ticks grow females up to like the size of your thumbnail, full of blood. And they take a large blood meal and ultimately drop off that moose and cause a mortality event for that moose, right? It ultimately kills the moose. And so it's important, again, I just want to highlight these 2 critical winter tick periods. That's a picture on the left there of questing winter ticks, how tiny they are, right? They're climbing that vegetation and they're seeking that host. They're waiting for a moose to come by, and there could be thousands in a clump, and they just get on that moose and they're comfortable on a moose hide all winter long until spring when they take a large blood meal, and we end up in that mortality period, that drop off period on the right side there. And so, this is important too. In a few minutes, when I'll be talking about challenges, right, and complexity of this issue and climate change, is just thinking about how weather can also influence these cycles of ticks, right? How that can have an impact. And I'll touch more on that in just a few minutes. So moving out kind of our summer field work into our spring field work into our summer field work, our work actually became even more intensive. We would spend every single day out tracking moose. And so we would sneak in. Our goal was to sneak up to our radio collared females, adults, and determine if they had a calf. And so we'd go into every moose every other day, which was hard to keep up with. And the goal was to see, A, did they have a calf? And B, did that calf survive to its 60th day? And it's a really critical time for that little neonate, that young calf, in their ability to survive up to that first year mark. And we found a lot of our adult females, although they're not dying from winter ticks, we hardly ever saw calves with adult females with 2 calves, where that used to be commonplace. And so we think that, winter ticks, although they may not be killing that adult, they are having an impact on an adult's ability to actually reproduce viable offspring. So, this was a great opportunity as a state employee, a seasonal technician, to get out there and get to know your study animal. As you can imagine, we got to really know moose. I got to walk in and see these individuals literally giving birth, calves taking their very first steps, spending literally hundreds and hundreds of hours with these animals, oftentimes without them having any idea you're there. So really an amazing opportunity, and kind of the positive aspect of the job was being able to watch these animals be born and note habitat conditions and other things of that nature. So after working kind of on this field research project for several years, I actually had the opportunity to go to grad school at University of Vermont, and the focus of my work was really on habitat conditions, right? Where were moose spending time on the landscape? With those radio collars, we could look at all those points and get a better idea of where were moose. I won't necessarily dive into all the logistics of that work, but I just want to touch on a couple things. First is, on a broad scale, when we look at an area like this over in Bloomfield, Vermont, it looks different than a lot of the state, right? You have big areas of cuts on the landscape that are highlighted in red there. Big areas of industrial paper cutting, which is different than we see in a lot of other areas of Vermont. And this is really great for moose. A lot of our areas up in the Northeast Kingdom look like that on the left. There's a ton of forage. This is ideal moose habitat. Moose need that regeneration. I would say that's probably most important for moose. But with that, we also found that moose really need canopy cover as well, right? It's not all about that. They need that forage, but they also need areas of cover for thermal regulation. Moose can become stressed at just 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And so having an area where they can get into shade, lay down, is crucially important to moose and their health. And so that's important as a landowner too, right? When you're thinking about composition of cuts and cover and access to wet areas, these are all important when we're thinking about moose. But moose tend to have large home ranges. They're big animals. And so, it really matters kind of the percentage of that over a larger area. And so, just to quickly touch on some of the results from some of our habitat work here in Vermont, this is a rough map looking at Essex County up in Vermont. And the areas of darker red, this is a predicted occupancy model for our collared moose. So those areas in red, darker red, are really showing, in general, if you were to go out into Essex County, where were you most likely to run into moose? And these are areas where you'd most likely run into them. You can think of them kind of as like a hot spot, right? Those are areas that, for whatever reason, that habitat and those blocks provide really suitable areas for moose. So they spend a lot of time there. And we had the opportunity to kind of relate that question of, where are moose spending time to this issue of winter tick mortality, right? That's a big question of, can we relate that issue of where moose are spending time to how many ticks they pick up? It's a really challenging one to do. But I will say we kind of found some clues that pointed towards what we were thinking and supported some of our ideas. So if you look at these two maps here, the map on the left is highlighting areas where moose with calves that died were spending time, right? Those areas in dark green are showing areas where she spent the most time, or all of those individuals spent the most time. And if we remember from our last slide, that kind of overlaps with our predicted occupancy. So if you think about where moose are spending time with calves that died, so they're picking up those winter ticks. This is during that period when they're picking up ticks in particular. So if they're going out there and spending time with a lot of other moose, right, high density areas, they're likely to pick up more ticks and die from winter ticks. Whereas that moose on the map on the right, rather, these were individuals who had calves that we know survived past their first birthday. And the areas of dark green on that map are showing where they spent the most time, where the areas of light, pink are not. And so as you can see from that, they were spending areas that was kind of counterintuitive to our occupancy model. For whatever reason, those moose were kind of pushed to the outskirts of what we would call maybe the most suitable habitat or where our highest densities were. And so that was advantageous for those cow moose, right, to have calves that survive. They weren't picking up as many ticks. And so, I kind of like to relay that message by talking about COVID. It's an example we can all kind of relate to, unfortunately, where areas where there's high densities of humans, it's more likely to spread, right? And that's the same idea when we're talking about moose and winter ticks. Areas where there's a lot of overlap with other moose, your chances of those ticks being picked up increases dramatically. Whereas moose that are spending time kind of on the outskirts where there's fewer moose, their calves tend to, they likely still pick up ticks, just not enough to kill them. And so just to highlight that here, a quick couple slides that show kind of what I'm talking about. Moose in that fall questing period, if they're moving around the landscape, they're going to pick up pretty much all of those questing winter ticks, right? A vast majority of them, and then drop them all off. And that cycle kind of continues and, proliferates, and you get this issue of ticks killing moose. And that's kind of a natural cycle in a lot of ways, right? It just can be very drawn out and gruesome. Whereas if we have fewer moose on the landscape, lower densities of moose, a lot of those winter ticks quest and either don't get picked up or they don't get picked up by a moose, right? They get picked up by something else that grooms them off, and they don't go through their life stages and drop eggs and proliferate. And so, it's just an illustration showing kind of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about moose density related to winter ticks. And so that was kind of a very quick run through of some of our findings from our moose research study here in Vermont. And I want to kind of, the second half of this, or the last few slides of this talk, touch on some of the challenges that moose are facing here in Vermont, other than winter ticks. So, a big one, an overarching topic, obviously, that Kate had mentioned and relates to winter ticks is a changing weather patterns. So climate change is and will continue to be a challenge for moose, particularly in a place like Vermont, southern New England. We're experiencing increases in temperature, upwards of 2 degrees warming in the summer, and an average of 4 degrees in the winter. That's very significant for a large boreal animal like a moose. And so NOAA's long-range temperature map for New England, I think, gave a temperature increase of 80%, 80% chance of being above normal during the summer months. And so that's really crucial for an animal, like I said, that becomes heat stressed at just 57 degrees Fahrenheit. How will that change moose behavior, where moose exist here in New England? And again, being at that southern periphery of moose range, changing temperatures, how will that change other influences that affect moose, such as winter ticks and other parasite loads, right? I mean, if you have those shorter winters and longer questing periods, that gives that tick an ample opportunity to actually get on the moose and successfully drop off and lay eggs. Same with that spring drop off period. If they're falling off on that image on the bottom there on leaf litter in the spring, those ticks have a higher chance of surviving, laying eggs, and kind of proliferating that cycle. So another challenge that moose face across much of the state is habitat availability, right? We talk about habitat for moose here in Vermont. If we look at the woods on the right, what would be the pros or cons for a more mature forest like this? A lot of our woods in Vermont looks like that, right? And there can be benefits for that for moose. As I mentioned, thermoregulation, getting out of the sun into that canopy, laying down. In the winter months, the softwood cover in particular really can capture snow. And if you get snow depths of 36 or more inches, that can be critical for moose, especially one that's covered with ticks, to be able to kind of hold out for a few weeks in an area of protection. But moose can't have woods that looks all like that, right? They need forage. An adult female moose could eat 40 to 60 pounds of leaves every day. That's a huge amount of forage. And if you have a high density of moose, they need a lot of that. And so, a lot of Vermont's woods don't look like that, or they're not suitable for carrying moose on the landscape. And so that is a challenge and will continue to be a challenge for our moose moving forward here in the state, and just something to think about as land managers. Another parasite that's important to touch on that's related to climate change, I think, would be brainworm, right? Brainworm is one that you may have heard of that can have a significant impacts on moose at a population level. So brainworm, it's just real quick, it's picked up by a slug. A deer can eat that slug, but deer kind of evolved with that with that slug. And that larvae, drops off into feces, and that slug will eat it and then climb up leaves, and something like a moose comes along and eats that slug. And that worm will actually travel up the spinal cord into the brain of the moose, and we start to see symptoms and typically mortality from those issues. And so that's just another issue. We don't tend to see that a ton up in the Northeast Kingdom because we don't have high densities of deer. But as weather changes, will the deer population move north? Will areas become more suitable for deer and overlap of deer and moose? So that's an issue that will continue to be challenging for managers to deal with and think about is brainworm, and that's a challenging one to manage for. But it's something to think about moving forward for our moose population here in kind of their southern range. So, much of what I've talked about here today is the Northeast Kingdom. It involves the Northeast Kingdom, Essex County. And, that was the highlight of our study because that's prime moose habitat, highest density of moose in the state. But I did want to kind of end on touching on a couple of significant movements we documented by our collared moose, which I think is just kind of not only interesting, but kind of has a bigger message as well. So this is an example of number 52. She was a radio collared moose. They're numbered with ear tags as well. We collared her in Bloomfield, Vermont as a calf. And as a yearling, she moved all the way to Fayston, Vermont. So over 90 miles as the crow flies. And much further in terms of her path. But it's important to think about. Then she turned around. She hung out in Fayston for maybe a week or two, and then went all the way back to New Hampshire. And I bring this up. We had another moose, number 3, who did a similar movement because although Essex County is our prime moose habitat, we know from genetic work as well that moose move. Right, they're these big animals. They have big home ranges, but they also make big movements, and that's critically important for genetics. But also as we continue to see challenges, right, for climate change, moose species like moose, they're going to need the freedom to move. And so habitat degradation or loss due to development These corridors of movement, of large tracts of woods are going to be critical for movement for moose. This particular moose likely moved in that Worcester NEK linkage corridor there, up into the Northeast Kingdom and back. And it's amazing. She crossed, some major roads and things of that nature. But as managers, as people who care about wildlife, beyond moose, but particularly large animals that make these big movements, this will be critically important to connect our moose population with northern New Hampshire and Maine, and Canada. And so, although that maybe not be right in your backyard, I think it's something to really advocate for and think about when we're thinking about habitat conservation and wildlife management here in Vermont and beyond. And so, I could chat about moose for hours, and that's a really quick overview of some of the things we've touched on here in Vermont for our moose study, some of the challenges that moose are facing due to, climate change, changing forest, loss of habitat, heavy parasite loads, things of that nature. And hopefully with our continued effort to monitor and manage our moose population and the habitats they depend on, using that most up-to-date science, we can encourage healthier individuals and habitats to really help alleviate some of the consequences from those stresses. So with that, I'll end my talk here today. And if anybody has questions, we have plenty of time, I think, to touch on some stuff. So thanks a lot for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. And thanks so much for sharing all that information. I should have mentioned at the onset that you're really a phenomenal wildlife photographer as well. So I think a lot of these pictures were pictures that you took. So thank you again for sharing all that information. Again, plenty of time for questions. Let's get a conversation going. So go ahead and put some questions in the chat box, or if you would like, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question live. Josh, as folks are thinking about questions, going back to that, I was just really impressed with the radio collaring that you did on the moose that from the Bloomfield area down to Facein and back. Give us a sense of timeline. Was that over a year or over a summer season? What was the timeline of that tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really interesting one. That was over the course of just a few weeks. So she made that movement from Bloomfield over to Facein in I think just under 2 weeks. Stopping occasionally in like Worcester. She stopped for a short period of time. But when moose are on their feet, if you've spent time around moose up close, they're huge animals, and they can cover some big areas if they have their mindset to it. Similar to a deer, if they have the goal of just walking, and they don't really stop, they can cover big areas. I think I mentioned that other one, that moved all the way to Bath, Maine, Gray, Maine, sorry. And that was similar movement, like over 90 miles, as the crow flies. And in New England, we don't, we do see big movements like that on occasion into different areas of the state or beyond. But for the most part, our moose, I think our female adult moose over the course of a year, averaged over a year, had like a 4 square mile home range, whereas our bulls might be something like 10 square miles. And so, as moose go in North America, that seems like a really big home range, but in a lot of ways that actually is pretty localized as moose populations, because moose in New England tend to have everything they need within close range. They can find food, cover, water, all sorts of different things within close range. But a big movement like that may not be unusual in a place like Alaska, right, or British Columbia, where these moose are making these big movements seasonally, because habitats are spread so far on the landscape. But yeah, just an interesting thing to note here in New England.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, we have a couple of questions that have come in, and again, I encourage folks. I think Evelyn, looks like you have a question, so I'll let you go first.
A couple of questions. So the tick issue is actually, we've known about this for a while, and you're studying obviously more carefully where the populations are picking this up and where there's density and less density. So with this information, and I guess I have some link questions with all this. So how are you using this information to alleviate the problem? And since climate change isn't going anywhere except making it all hotter, we're going to obviously have more problems with ticks who are surviving over winters. Is there any chance of using a four-poster program to get the damn ticks off the moose? I mean, we're studying them, we know what the problem is. So what is a solution? I mean, I guess you could just study watching them die for the next 10 years. So we had a house in Fire Island, we had four-poster programs that cleaned up the sort of local deer population, and it reduced Lyme. But it also helped the deer, they kind of got healthier. So just curious about that. And what is the current population of moose right now? And I'm in Mount Holly, by the way, and we have moose here. And we do
Oh,
see
yeah.
not
Yeah,
as much. Yeah, not as
There's
much.
moose all over the state. Yeah,
Yeah.
we get moose all over Vermont. Yeah, those are some big questions, right? And so what we're doing, there's a lot of things that we're doing in terms of, or have been doing in terms of research, right? We're trying to get a better grasp on what's happening here. And a lot of times people want a quick, easy solution to that, right? And the reason I say that is, you know, this is a really complicated issue. It's not as easy as just eliminating ticks and getting rid of them. I mean, ticks are part of the system. These winter ticks are actually native to Vermont. They've been on moose for as long as moose have been here. And so to go out there and spray them, for example, is challenging in a lot of ways, right? One is these winter ticks are not active in the summertime. They're underground. They're not out there getting on your dog. They're not getting on you. They're not out there like deer tick or dog ticks. They're dormant. They come out in the fall. And so, you know, maybe you could put out something at some point in time.
Yes.
Some areas have in Canada, things of that nature. They find, you know, if you are treating every single individual calf moose, because again, you'd have to pretty much treat your calf moose. You're dealing with a wild animal, right? This isn't a livestock, so you have to somehow entice them in. Then you're putting chemicals all over the ground, right? Or all over a moose. What impact does that have on moose? Does the moose still die from winter ticks or some other issue? And then they're laying on the ground 400 pounds covered with chemical, and then things start scavenging on that and they start dying. You know, there's a lot of factors you have to think about when administering something that's going to kill something like a tick. It could have huge detrimental impacts. We do have researchers who are looking at things like natural fungi that can actually disrupt the winter tick cycle. That's a study that's been ongoing. And it's something to look into and something to think about. But how do you do that you know, across the landscape? And will that have impacts if you start disrupting the natural cycle of things and introducing more of a fungi? So there's big conceptual issues. This is an ecosystem level problem. And so, you know, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Canada, much of what's found to be when moose get into this cycle of epizootic mortality, we call it over 50% calf mortality, decreasing densities locally in areas using tools like hunting, for example, can have a profound impact on winter tick levels. And again, that is because moose are the driving factor of winter tick populations. Deer can carry winter ticks, bears can carry winter ticks, but they're not carrying 60,000 winter ticks. And so that changes what is really driving that winter tick population. So hunting, would say is our main tool, and that's primarily because we don't have natural predation in Vermont anymore, right? We don't have wolves. We don't have grizzly bears like some other areas where moose exist that would naturally keep moose at lower densities. You know, parts of our Northeast Kingdom are still above, you know, what we would consider in a lot of areas of North America, high moose densities. We're still above that threshold. You know, when we were at 5 moose per square mile, that was pretty much unheard of. That was like some of the highest in North America. And that is primarily because, you know, moose had come back to this huge array of perfect habitat, right? That had been cut over from things like spruce budworm, other issues, and moose had come back. And so we're foraging and healthy and fat and happy and having twins. And our moose population really boomed at that point. And like anything, when you're overpopulated, things can put it back into check. And that's essentially what we see with winter ticks, right? It can be this natural cycle that's putting moose back in check. It just comes down to, you know, a variety of different factors of how long will that happen over the course of time. And again, seeing these moose, you know, dying from winter ticks is a is really gruesome. It's stretched out over the course of several months in the wintertime, with severe blood all over the snow and things of that nature. Another question you had, I forget your last question. I think I touched on the first two maybe, but.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious about using hunting as a tool, obviously, to reduce the tick population, but how do you know which moose is the right one to hunt to help with this problem? Is it just any moose you kill, or is it certain moose that will help this problem? How do
Yeah.
you do
Ticks-
that?
Ticks don't necessarily pick a moose over another moose, right? They're picking up, they're getting on moose in areas where there's high density of moose.
Right, okay.
So, rather than pinpointing individual moose, for example, just overall reducing density in an area like Essex County in particular, which is the only area in Vermont where we even allow moose hunting.
Right.
Because we have really high densities still in some of those areas. And so the idea is if you can reduce overall density, not necessarily particular individuals, that will have an impact on how many winter ticks are actually on the landscape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Lots of great questions there, and there are a few more questions in the chat box. So I'd like to just kind of shift gears a little bit, and I'm sure we'll circle back to the winter tick issue because obviously it's a big part of the story here.
Yeah.
There's a question from Bill about you mentioned an enormous quantity of forage a moose requires. I believe it was 40 to 60 pounds, right? Are there specific tree species that are particularly beneficial to their diet? Josh, I'm wondering if you could comment on.
I mean, there are certain species that moose, I would say, prefer, they really love maple and, birch, well, actually not as much birch in some ways, but, maple, any hardwood species, moose aren't particularly, they're not really that picky. When you're going out there and you're, ripping apart, like I say, 40 plus pounds of vegetation, you're grabbing pretty much anything within reach. And moose have evolved to kind of break that down over time. And so, they're grabbing leaves and twigs and buds off pretty much any hardwood they can reach. Softwood, they don't really mess with too much until the winter time. They will forage on balsam fir and different species, which isn't high in nutrients, but it is something that they kind of have to depend on through the winter months. And it's a good point, moose really, similar to deer, they evolved to lose weight in the winter, right? That's normally what happens. They put on as much fat as they can in the summertime. They have to be foraging on their feet pretty much all day, every day to put on adequate weight in preparation to lose some of that weight. That's normal. Moose don't really eat as much in the winter months. And so, it's important too to think about that as they're naturally kind of losing health condition and losing weight. And so having 60,000 ticks on you just kind of creates more of an issue than you're able to actually deal with.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Sorry, I'm trying to. I lost track of my the chat box here. Okay, great. There's a couple more questions that have come in, and so interesting to be thinking about kind of the vegetation and that aspect of their diet and their health. There's a question from Phil that he comments. It seems like only a few years ago we were hearing about moose moving south. There was at least one breeding pair in Connecticut and one I believe was shot in Putnam County, southern New York, I guess. Well, can you talk a little bit about, sort of the, expanding and then sort of retraction or disappearing of the moose population across New England? Can you comment a little bit on kind of that, more regional scale?
Yeah, I can touch on that to a degree. Our moose population here in Vermont, as I said, we have individuals from what we consider kind of our source population, the Northeast Kingdom, that certainly moved to other parts of the state. We see moose pop up everywhere. I mean, as an undergrad at University of Vermont, I was walking from the library over towards the Aiken building, just as an example, walking in the middle of the day to class, not a lot of people around, and all of a sudden I see a large animal running down the ramp. And of course, my mind immediately went to like a horse for some reason, but it was an adult female moose in downtown Burlington. And so, we have moose all over the state. They certainly pop up, just not in high densities, as Evelyn mentioned, right? I mean, we have moose in other areas, just maybe not as high density as the Northeast Kingdom. And I'd say, we have moose populations in Massachusetts, in the Adirondacks, small population in Connecticut, obviously moose in New Hampshire, Maine. And in those more southern areas, Adirondacks, Massachusetts, Connecticut, we tend to not see mortality from winter ticks, which is interesting, right? You think, oh, these moose are more southern, they would have more issues related to that, and they may have issues with parasite load. Our moose had all sorts of other parasites as well, bot flies and lungworm and all sorts of other issues because we are at that southern edge of their range. But moose in, say, the Adirondacks, part of the reason we may not be seeing high mortality from winter ticks is, again, because they have fewer moose, right? They have fewer moose on the landscape. They do have some winter ticks, but they're not enough to kill the moose. And so, you have moose on the landscape, although fewer, healthier, right? And in a lot of ways, as somebody who loves moose, I would rather see fewer moose on the landscape, but a lot of really healthy moose. That's kind of, how I see it as well. So, anyway, that's just kind of an example of those. We do see moose occasionally move to other states. We've had, back and forth with other states in terms of our moose moving. But, northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, western Maine really is that kind of southern edge of like real moose habitat. You do have some pockets of populations in other states, but not a large population by any means.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about a question from Jas on the recent forestry operations and kind of thinking about, like you mentioned a little bit about early successional habitat. Can you talk a little bit about kind of a two-pronged question, I guess, and I'm going to build on this. Is there any relationship between forestry operations and the tick populations? But then I'd love you to kind of take that a step further and talk a little bit about kind of how, as forest managers and forest landowners, what are some of the habitat needs that we can be thinking about in terms of stewarding and managing our forests, not just on the property level but across the region. So I yeah, might have blown that question a little bit broader,
No,
but
no.
kind of a two-pronger, if you will.
Yeah, I think the winter tick issue and moose issue, that overlap of habitat. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information that we dove into for my work and our state's work, research, trying to kind of hone in on that question. And that's a question that a lot of researchers have been thinking about and trying to grapple with. Is we know a lot about moose, right? We know where moose tend to like to be. As I mentioned, they're pretty large home ranges. They need a lot of forage. I would say that's the biggest component of a moose home range. They're spending time in young forest, less than, say, 9 foot tall forage. They're anything within reach. That's where they're primarily spending time. But again, we also have moose that spend a lot of time in large bogs or in areas where they're able to get forage, but they're also spending time kind of on that fringe habitat. And across all of that, moose are more challenging than some other more you would call, very specific habitat needs. Moose are much more generalist in a lot of ways. They require large tract of forest. I mean, I would say that's the biggest thing, right? And that can be a variety of composition from softwood cover to hardwood cover. A mix of that is ideal, with big patches of softwood cover, ridge lines, high elevation, with also forage close by in close proximity, and also some areas of wetland, right? Moose require some wetland habitat as well for different nutrients in the spring, for example. But creating that habitat can be challenging, especially as a private landowner. If you just cut a bunch of trees on your property, and you're surrounded by development, for example, or other large chunks of unmanaged or unharvested forest, that doesn't necessarily mean all of a sudden moose are just going to beeline it to your property. And so when we think about moose management and moose harvesting, or habitat harvesting or habitat management for moose, it's a much broader scale than some other animals, right? And so a place like the Northeast Kingdom, in a lot of ways, that's not necessarily managed by paper companies or private landowners for moose in particular, but it's prime moose habitat, because you have large tracts of young forest. And so it's kind of that it's tricky. A lot of people say, I want to have moose on my property. And what I always say is, it's great to promote that habitat, to promote young growth in certain areas with gap cuts or different things of that nature, while retaining some cover and canopy, because that's just as important. But it is challenging, right? Because it's moose are existing where there's huge quantities of forage and large tracts of undisturbed forest. And so, you know, like there might be moose down in Mount Holly and there's a handful, and there's definitely moose in the Green Mountains. They're spending time there, but I don't think you'll ever have densities like you do in the Northeast Kingdom, because that habitat's just not there like it is up in the northeast corner of the state, or like parts of Maine, huge tracts of Maine that are, make Vermont's forest management look, it's just night and day in terms of, forest composition and forage for moose on the landscape.
Yeah, great. That's helpful, Josh. And I think you're, to your point, just the important kind of like sometimes we zoom in, right? And it's really important, especially with a species like moose and for a lot of our wildlife species and a lot of our values around our forests to zoom out and think about kind of how individual properties fit into the larger landscape, right? And so, things like you showed the picture of BioFinder and, some of the other tools that are available from the agency to help us, be thinking about that are really important. So that's great. Well, let's shift gears for a second here. And we have, with just a few minutes left, a question from Bill about what landowners can do to help monitor for moose populations. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of is there any assistance that landowners can provide the department in monitoring for populations or health?
Yeah, I mean, we always encourage, I get a lot, people know that I'm involved in moose work and have an interest in moose, both for a professional way and private way. And so I get a lot of people who reach out to me and just want to show pictures, share pictures, talk about moose, which, as biologists, I think all of us in the state really enjoy that interaction and knowing where people are starting to see moose again, where they haven't for a number of years, or anything along those lines. And that's, even if it's not necessarily going into our population model, for example, it is important for just anecdotally knowing what people are seeing on the landscape. That's important, right? And people's concerns and people's thoughts, we always encourage that. So feel free to reach out anytime if you have a moose on your property or have a question. We always encourage that. Another tool that we use here in Vermont, and other states use it as well, is if you're out during, say, the hunting season, the deer hunting season, for example, we do what's called the hunter survey. And so if you're out there, and a lot of people are, really hiking around in the woods and seeing different things, if you see moose during that time, it's really important to note that and submit a survey that gives us a really, a better representation in some of these areas where there's overlap with deer hunters of, what our moose population might look like in some of those areas. And so, yeah, as a landowner, there's a variety of different things you can do on your own too, right? Putting up game cameras. We have a lot of game cameras out. I didn't really speak to that, to Evelyn's question as well, but we have a lot of game cameras out looking at population numbers that way, kind of that, without having to collar moose, looking at individuals on the landscape, what their health looks like. You can find out a lot of, late winter, if a moose has lost a lot of their coat, for example, by rubbing off winter ticks and different things of that nature. And so there's more regional stuff happening with New Hampshire and Maine concerning cameras, but as a private landowner, that's something you can do as well. If you want to put up cameras and get an idea of how many moose you might have frequenting your acreage and share that information with us here at Vermont Fish and Wildlife, I think that's super valuable and always encourage people to do so.
That's great. I love your image, Josh. I'm imagining, we maybe there's a set up a moose rub post campaign, right? In addition to a game camera campaign. So very cool. You just, with a few seconds left here, we've been talking a lot about moose populations, and I just want to circle back, I know the department has done a ton of work researching and understanding kind of the dynamics of the population over time. Do you guys have a sort of set targeted population around the state that you're, that you're managing towards, or, I mean, what is the moose? You talked about carrying capacity, right? And so, kind of share a little bit about kind of what the current thinking of the department is around how you're managing for a healthy population and what that means in terms of carrying capacity.
Yeah, so, I think sometimes we get hung up on that number of moose on the landscape, right? Like how many moose do we have? And that is an important thing to keep in mind and think about, and managers have done that for years. And I do think that's important, albeit really difficult. It's really hard to get a really, super accurate representation of how many moose we have on the ground. I mean, some areas do actively fly, some states like Maine, I think New Hampshire's done that some as well. Flying in the wintertime and actually counting moose on transects. That can be a strategy when you get into areas with heavy forest cover and things and different topographies. That can be really challenging, as you can imagine. But giving an idea of how many moose on the landscape is important. But I do think sometimes people get a little hung up on the number. And the number of moose, we certainly want to have an idea. But I think more important than overall number of moose on the landscape is density, right? And so when we're talking about density within areas, whether it be wildlife management units or towns, whatever it may be, I think that can be more important for overall management and health of individual moose. And so Vermont and beyond, when we go to moose conferences and talk to people, there's kind of a magic number, and that's 1 moose per square mile. That's kind of like if you have more than 1 moose per square mile, you tend to have issues with parasite loads, particularly winter ticks. We've seen that from, I've had moose biologists tell me that from Northern Canada, Western Canada, guys from the 70s who are looking at moose populations, and they've seen those kind of ups and downs of moose population. And they say, if your moose population exceeds that and exceeds that by, a couple moose per square mile, you can start to have some serious issues with mortality. And so I would say, to answer your question, less than like overall number, which again is important to think about, and we certainly try our best to capture it. It's a little more manageable to think about density within a smaller area, like a wildlife management unit.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks, Josh. It's interesting just to think about, right? And to kind of, be able to sort of wrap our heads around it. Well, unfortunately, we're at time, and so I feel like we could talk about moose for hours. And I just really want to, on behalf of everybody at VWA, Vermont Woodlands Association, thank you, Josh, for taking the time to join us today and share some of this research and some of the thinking from the department, and some things that we as landowners and folks who are working to manage our forests here in Vermont can be thinking about to help our moose population into the future. So thank you so much, Josh. And this whole winter tick issue, I think clearly there's a lot of work still to be done and things to be figured out. Some research you mentioned that was still happening. So we'll just have to have you back, hopefully, and another time, and kind of get an update on what's happening with that fungus that you mentioned, and some of the other work that the department is doing to help address this issue with the moose population and the challenges, like you said, that they're facing here given our changing climate. So with that, we are at time. And again, I just want to thank everybody for participating today. Just a quick reminder, if you're a consulting forester hanging on, we will be sending out continuing education credits for the presentation today. And again, thank you on behalf of everybody from Vermont Woodlands Association. We encourage you to check us out online. We have more programs coming up in September that you might be interested in. And the climate series is going to be taking a little bit of a break. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go out into the Groton State Forest as we had originally planned next week in order to do the woods walk with Josh on moose habitat. But we will be rescheduling that. So look for more information from us in the coming months. We're looking at scheduling something maybe in early 2025. Although those pictures of victory, Josh, remind me that sometimes, maybe in the winter, depending on what kind of snow year we have, we may hold off a little bit later into the spring.
I hope we have that much snow. We'll see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So stay tuned for more information from us from an opportunity to get out in the woods with Josh and actually look at some moose habitat and really dive into these issues a little bit more. So with that, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. And again, thank you, Josh, for sharing all this great information. We really appreciate it.